Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name's Shelly Kessler, and together with my colleague Ann Sherman, we're going to spend the next hour talking about dynamic planning in a changing environment. Our objectives for today are, as you see in this next slide, to gather some insights into how strategic planning's role and benefits may be evolving in the new reality. Also, we want to understand the various phases of strategic plan development. We'd also like to look at how we're going to harness the power of planning for leading in times of change and uncertainty. And finally, our key objective is putting the strategic back into strategic planning. Before we really start our session, I'd like to tell everyone that if you have questions, please add them to the chat or question box, and we'll try and answer them at the end of the presentation, or if possible, during the presentation. The webinar will be available on tccgroup.com after this presentation. So I'd like to start with a question. True or false? In the current environment, strategic planning is not relevant for my nonprofit. Well, from our perspective, the answer is false. Although we've heard this statement a lot lately, we believe that in the current environment, strategic planning is more important than ever. Strategic planning can and should be an energizing process that takes into account the rapid changes in the environment and adapts planning to the needs and realities of nonprofit organizations and positions them for greater impact. During this presentation, we'd like to share some new thinking about planning and how it can be not only relevant but dynamic. Now, Ann will take us through the first half of the presentation, focusing on some strategic planning fundamentals and strategic planning in a new reality.
Thanks, Shelley, and hi everyone. My name is Ann Sherman. I'm an associate director at TCC Group and have worked with nonprofits on strategic planning and business planning and other organizational development work for nearly 11 years. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about some of our assumptions and our lessons learned at TCC with respect to strategic planning. So those of you in the audience have a sense of where we're coming from. We're talking about strategic planning, dynamic planning in a changing environment, and part of the change in our thinking has to do with why strategic planning even matters in the first place. I think that for many of us in the sector, we've come to assume that it's just a good thing to do for no other reason, something you do for basic health and hygiene like exercising or eating your green vegetables. But with the changing environment and changing reality that we live in, we think it's helpful to take a step back and really question why are we investing the time and the resources that strategic planning requires when there's so much pressure coming from all different directions. I think one of the things about that we've learned over the past 2 years is that we've been forced to question assumptions that maybe we took for granted before. And I think it was always a good practice, but is particularly important now for us to be rethinking our mission, our core purpose, why we exist, and also the vision for the organization. Do the same assumptions hold true? And that this would be, again, true in any strategic planning process, but is particularly important now. It's also an important opportunity to remind stakeholders or have stakeholders discuss and reaffirm the value of the work and how a strategic plan can contribute to longer-term sustainability. It forces you to articulate strategic direction that will allow you to make progress on achieving your mission, and is also a very important leadership tool. Again, it's always been a leadership tool, but in an environment, in a climate where we're more stressed than ever, where resources are scarcer than ever, leaders, I think, need all the help they can get. It also is important as a communications tool and ask stakeholders to really articulate the value proposition of their organization. Again, perhaps a slightly different way of thinking about strategic planning than we might have thought about it in the past. And by value proposition, what we mean is understanding the benefit that you offer to your target audiences or to your community, and the ways in which that benefit is distinctive. Some organizations may have a unique mission or a unique strategy, but there are many organizations that have a mission that's pretty similar to that of many others in the field. But for that nonprofit that's seeking resources in a competitive environment, it's increasingly important to talk about the value proposition and what makes your organization distinctive, what sets you apart in the eyes of funders or potential board members or potential staff or potential customers for that matter. Planning has always been and continues to be a tool for understanding and managing changes in the external environment. And finally, looks for the match between what you do well, your internal capacity, and the mission that you're striving to achieve. We can go to the next one. Thanks. And this next Venn diagram is really a more succinct way of stating some of the things I talked about in the previous slide. Certainly for nonprofits, everything starts with mission and the core purpose of an organization. Then we look for external environment. What are the opportunities and threats in the external environment that are most relevant to your organization? And finally, your internal capacity. We talked about this a minute ago. What you do well, and also what you're not doing so well. And the place where those three circles intersect is the opportunity for you to have greatest impact. It's really your niche, and the strategic plan should really grow from that point of intersection. We've also learned a lot in the years that we've been doing strategic planning here at the firm about processes that work. And for those of you who are interested, TCC has a briefing paper on its website called 10 Keys to Successful Strategic Planning that goes into some of these topics in a little more depth. But some of the most important ones, and again, some of the ones that we think have particular relevance in the current climate, we've outlined here. First and foremost is organizational readiness, and this is a subject that comes up, I think, for any type of change effort or capacity building effort. Really understanding, are we ready to engage? And that means, one, do we understand what's at stake? We talk about change and some of the difficult decisions. Are we willing to explore those honestly, even though we probably don't know what they all are at the beginning of the process? And are we willing to have candid conversations? Strategic planning processes, successful ones, in our experience, also need a certain amount of time. We understand the importance for momentum and decision-making and a sense of progress on the one hand. On the other hand, we tend not to recommend the weekend process or the strategic planning process that's completed over the course of, say, a 2-day board retreat. Because to engender engagement and buy-in and to really get the information that you need and to have the discussions that are needed to be had about vision and about priorities, it takes a little more time than that. Going back to the idea of organizational readiness is the concept of strong leadership. And this applies to both staff and board. And again, is about a willingness to change and a desire to make significant changes, perhaps, in the organization's best interest. Inclusion is important, getting a diverse set of perspectives informing your data collection and your decision-making as appropriate. And on the topic of inclusion, I should just say that while we believe in inclusion as as a core principle, we understand that it might look different for different organizations depending on their size, their age, their mission, the diversity of stakeholders that they interact with, who they consider their core audiences, etc. So there's no one formula for successful inclusion, but we do think it's an important principle in general. Also having an understanding of whether you can afford strategic planning at a particular point in time, both from a financial perspective, what does it cost in terms of dollars and cents, and also in terms of the time that's required to do it well. There's time in terms of duration, several months, and then also even if you hire a consultant, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent slide, it does require the time of leadership and also some administrative organizational work. We've talked about the desire for change, and the last thing about strategic planning processes that work is explores as it gets ready to engage in strategic planning. And these are really pretty basic things. I think the overall point that we're trying to make here is that it should be a deliberate process, a thought-out process, and that the more groundwork you can lay in the beginning, the better positioned you'll be to have a successful strategic plan and a really valuable plan at the end. We can go to the next slide. And actually, before we move to the next slide, I'm seeing a question here that I'll address. The listener asked, why should we limit our area of focus by our internal weaknesses when that can be changed? And if I had suggested that, I apologize. That was a mistake on my part. Internal capacity is about looking both at what you do well and what you don't do well as part of a larger picture of where you want to go in the future. Certainly there are some things that you will need to strengthen in order to achieve the vision you set out in your plan, and there's some things that you might not be able to prioritize in this particular strategic plan. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the new reality, the environment that we're operating in, and how it relates to strategic planning. I think the new reality is obviously the landscape, both in terms of funding and demand for services and the ways in which the sector operates, the ways in which nonprofits interact with each other, interact with their funders, both private and public. The recession has clearly changed all of those things. It's a new landscape. In addition to the things I mentioned, while we've been seeing an increased emphasis on accountability and documenting results, it's been our experience that the demand for those things has accelerated over the past 2 years. It's become even more important for nonprofits to be able to discuss those things and document them. And also a heightened sense of urgency that perhaps we hadn't seen prior to 2008. So when we talk about success, one of the things, and successful nonprofit, one of the things that the points we really want to drive home is that successful organizations are those that can take data, information, either about their operations, their programs, what's going on in the external environment, take that information and derive meaning from it. Understand, what does that mean for us? What are the implications for us? And really use those findings, use those perceptions to figure out, to determine what the right course is for your organization, how you are going to maximize the impact of your organization. So strategic planning does look a little different today than it might have a couple of years ago. One thing I think that's affected the way we approach strategic planning is just that there's so much more uncertainty. When I joined the firm over 10 years ago, it was very common for us to do 5-year strategic plans for our clients. And even before 2008, we weren't doing so many 5-year plans. More common was the 3-year strategic plan. And while we certainly still have many clients that want 3-year strategic plans, we also are working with more organizations that really just find it very challenging to look that far into the future in any kind of meaningful way. Or there might be a 3-year vision or a 5-year vision or even a 10-year vision. The big picture might look far into the future, but the actual implementation plan, the framework at the plan itself, might have a shorter time frame or a more focused time frame. And this really speaks to the fourth point on the slide, which is that for many organizations, strategic planning needs to be more of a compass or a framework, a set of guidelines for making decisions or changing course, as opposed to a blueprint or a roadmap that's going to spell out what you're going to be doing, say, in October of 2013. There's just too much uncertainty. Another change that we've seen is the blurring in some ways of strategic planning and business planning. And while that's the topic of a whole other webinar, we did want to mention here that strategic planning in this environment has put a greater spotlight on the business model. Certainly the recession and its effects have uncovered weaknesses in the business model for many nonprofit organizations. And so you can't really plan effectively without carefully examining your assumptions related to revenues and expenses, and also past performance and how that might look in the future. And then finally, relating to the previous slide about the use of data to improve quality and impact, we just want to reiterate that success really depends on leaders who can learn, who can collect data, learn from it, and make good decisions based on that information. So what does it mean to put the strategic into strategic planning? One thing that we've observed that we think is worth noting is that traditionally we've looked at strategic planning as very comprehensive, meaning mission and vision and values, programs and services, and then the whole continuum of different parts of operations that go into a strategic plan: governance, staffing, management, and operations, finance and fundraising, external communications, maybe facilities, etc. We want to suggest that there may be another model for planning that offers an alternative, that's a more focused, a more narrowly focused planning process. And Shelly's going to talk in greater depth about this, but we'll just point out here that so much of this really hinges on how we look at the upfront diagnostic phase or the very initial data collection to be more efficient in uncovering the critical issues upfront that will allow an organization to decide whether they really want to go broad in their planning or whether they want to be more focused and go a little deeper into a smaller number of areas. And so this last slide that I'm going to talk about are just some guiding questions that we have found to be very helpful in our strategy work with our clients. What are the priorities in reaching our mission? The mission might be broad, but really what do we do particularly well? Again, about that intersection, that Venn diagram, and really looking for that impact, the place where the three things overlap, understanding what we do well, what we do at least as well as our competition, thinking as leaders, how do we anticipate change and what's going on in the environment, and how, of course, do we adapt to that? Are we resilient in the sense that we are aware of opportunities and risks, and we can understand what we think they're going to mean for us? How can we capitalize on opportunities and minimize the risk? Understanding really who our key stakeholders are, and how in a challenging environment we can increase their interest in us and their commitment to our mission. And then finally, a question that can be a tough one to ask, but is increasingly important, is what's our thinking about the ongoing relevance of our work? Again, this is a question that we would hope any organization is asking itself as part of good health and hygiene. But again, in a time of constrained resources, to have a competitive advantage, to really articulate a value proposition in a compelling way, there needs to be consensus about whether the work we're doing now will be relevant 3, 5, 10 years from now. How do we know that, and how do we communicate that? And so that brings us up to the next part of the presentation, and I'm going to pass the mic back to Shelly.
Thanks, Anne. Now we're going to get a bit more concrete and focus on some of the key components of planning. As you can see from this diagram, and starting from the left, we begin with a diagnostic phase. This leads us to internal and external assessments, program analysis, creating a new vision, developing a plan, and finally allocating resources, responsibility, creating a timeline and a process for ongoing assessment. As we're going to discuss in the next few slides, the real change in our approach to planning lies in that first diagnostic phase, where we can make decisions about the breadth or depth of the planning process. As Anne noted earlier, there are a number of reasons that an organization might want to do a more highly focused plan. And these include uncertainty in the environment, limited financial or human resources to commit to planning, or just simply some issues that demand attention above all others. And it's not always a weakness or a negative. It could be that there are some new opportunities out there that the organization really wants to focus on and develop, and feels that above all else, those are the ones that it needs to really focus on. So if we talk about the phase 1 diagnostic period, we talk about it in the sense that in more traditional strategic planning processes, we enter with more of a fully formed picture as to what we're going to do during the planning process. The process that we're proposing right now allows us as consultants and you as nonprofits to be more responsible to the changing needs and priorities for the organization. It allows us to tailor and target the process in a way that might not have been as possible previously. The diagnostic phase does exactly what its name implies. It gives you a diagnosis of where the organization is at that point in time, using a variety of key data points. During the diagnostic, we work with a small number of high-level stakeholders who have a strong understanding of the organization. And these typically include board and senior staff, or people with specific expertise that really can add to the process. We utilize a variety of rapid assessment tools, such as the SWOT analysis. I'm sure you've all heard of that: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The CCAT, which is TCC's core capacity assessment tool, which gives you a reading and how the organization is doing against 4 core capacities that are considered essential to success, those being leadership, adaptive, management, and technical. We also use the logic model during this process to help clarify the outcomes we expect to see as a result of our strategy. That simply means that instead of talking about strategies, we get the organization or to start a conversation about outcomes. What is it you want to be responsible for? What do you want to see that you're willing to say we can measure? And we're going to see a relationship between that outcome and our strategy. The diagnostic phase is structured to give insight into what is critical and what, while may be important, may not be essential to address at this point in time. One comment I want to make about the diagnostic phase is that it is in many ways a rapid assessment. We're not trying to go deep during this period. We're trying to really create a framework for the organization and understand where the organization sits, what's important to it, what its values are, and really begin to understand what might take it forward into the future. So what are some of the questions that you might ask during a diagnostic? In order to get a firm hold on what might be priorities for an organization, we sort of see that there are some fundamental questions that you would ask. These center on mission and vision, the alignment between programs and mission, organizational capacity, leadership, financial health, and basic assumptions around the external environment and future trends. By the end of the diagnostic phase, the organization is able to decide how best to focus the planning process. Just to be clear, many organizations are still going to choose to take a comprehensive approach to the planning process, but do so with an understanding of their priority issues after the diagnostic phase. Other organizations might decide to focus primarily on the 2 or 3 issues that they have identified as core and build the plan around these elements. The choices made at the end of this phase dictate the type and amount of data that you're going to collect in the subsequent phases. One caveat that should be mentioned here is that while the planning process can be streamlined and focused, there are certain issues that must always be addressed. And we've talked a little bit about those. Mission and vision, financial health. Regardless of how you're going to focus, you really need to make sure that you're looking at these key elements. And secondly, you have to take into consideration any needed supporting elements of your priority areas. For example, perhaps an organization, let's call it Organization A, emerges from the diagnostic phase and decides that among its priorities is strengthening its advocacy work. That's where they see an opportunity. That's where they feel that they can really make a difference. The plan may focus on building advocacy, but as part of that, it will also have to look at staff capacity, technology, funding, etc. And you're also going to want to look at issues of reputation, competition, market, etc. externally. So even in a streamlined fashion, you want to make sure that you're giving your organization a holistic picture around the elements that are important to you. If you're in the internal and external assessments, we talk about, and that's our phase 2. We've all, assuming we finish the diagnostic, we have clarity around focus, and then we're going to begin the data gathering process that builds on the decisions coming out of the diagnostic. Data are gathered around the questions or issues identified as priorities, both internally and externally. If during the diagnostic phase the choice is to narrow the focus, the data collection stage will be equally limited. For example, an organization that really feels that it needs to focus on its internal capacities may decide that it wants to do only a limited literature review around their program area to get a read on best practices in the field, and assess themselves narrowly against those practices. The majority of its data gathering might be focused on 2 or 3 other critical areas. The methodology used for collecting data is also dependent on your choices and resources, with the caveat that each methodology has its limitations. In our example of an organization choosing to do a literature search that could provide best practices, it's important to understand what a literature search won't provide. It doesn't tell you what your clients think of these services. It doesn't assess staff capacity in delivering them. And it doesn't tell you whether this is the best use of your resources. So your choices here have a large impact on the information you will have available for decision making. And so as you look at this slide, it really, as we look at gathering data, it's really about fleshing out your key questions, making sure you explore why you're distinctive in those areas, your value proposition, as Anne talked about previously, and really building the data that either helps substantiate some of your hypotheses that you set forth at the beginning of the process in your diagnostic phase, or tells you that maybe you need to think otherwise. So some of our other issues related to our external environment, again, the depth of the external review depends on the focus. At minimum, you really need to look at some of the issues on this slide. How do stakeholders view us? What are the funding opportunities? What's our reputation, our image, our brand? Who are, even in maybe the few areas that you've picked out, who's our competition, our potential partners? What are some of the changing trends in the field, and what are the cutting-edge strategies that we need to understand? And when we talk about competition, I see that there was a question about who's the competition for a food bank or an after-school program. There are other organizations out there offering similar services. If you're in the situation where you're a monopoly, meaning there's no one else in the field, then perhaps the question is not valid. But our experience shows that typically there are some other organizations sharing your space. There are other organizations that might be serving the same population you are with similar services, even if they're not exactly the same, and even if they're not called the same thing you are.
Shelly, could I just add also there's different ways to think about competition. So it might be competition for clients or customers, in the way a company or a business, a for-profit business might look at competition. But I would say almost certainly a food bank or an after-school program, whether or not it's the only game in town, so to speak, is competing with other nonprofits for funding. And it's probably competing with other nonprofits for board members and excellent staff. So there are different. Maybe I should have been. I could have been a little bit more explicit when I talked about competition. That it's a broad, it's a multifaceted concept that we think needs a little more attention for the nonprofit sector. Anyone who has something that you might also want, in a way, is your competition.
Thanks, Anne. So looking at your internal assessment, things that you're going to need to look at on the internal side of the organization, these also can be focused on your priority areas in Streamline. As you probably remember, many of these questions figure in the diagnostic phase as well. The data collection phase allows you to go deeper into those areas flagged as priority to probe the initial findings from the diagnostic. For example, the diagnostic might have surfaced important issues around leadership. During this phase, you may want to probe how extensive these issues are. What's the impact on the reputation of the organization? or the ability of the organization to raise funds. So you might be looking at, as you sort of probe in these various areas, what you're trying to really look at is where are our opportunities that we can capitalize on both internally and externally. What are the implications of some of our choices? How do we make sure that we continue to deliver on our mission in a way that is most effective, that we're able to guarantee program quality and impact to both our clients and our donors? And how do we understand what is needed in our organization today, both from our leaders, which might be our executive leadership, it might be our governance, and also from our staff, our members, if you're a membership organization, or all the other stakeholders that make up what we consider our business model. So it's really important as we look at some of these questions to understand that while you don't have to cover the waterfront, that you can be targeted and specific. You do need to make sure that you ask some of the hard questions that are going to better position yourself for the future. So the data collection phase usually ends up with some sort of document or presentation that brings all those findings together. Some people, we tend to call that a situational analysis. Other people may just call it a report on findings. But you really need to bring all that data together to really understand what it means and what the implications are for the organization. So the data, say at the period of time the data collection's finished, you've gotten your report from your external consultants or from whomever has done it. The planning committee is then reconvened for an in-depth discussion so as to derive real meaning from the data, make decisions, and formulate a strategic framework. We find it helpful to develop some scenarios based on the findings, based on, possible options for the future. So often what we say is that you've collected a lot of data around some key questions. What does the data tell us, and what options are available for the organization going forward? And typically we find that the options vary depending on what the organization wants to do. I mean, there may be options of growth, and for some organizations, that's what they're going to want to do. Some organizations may be high risk takers and want to really push the envelope. Others may choose a different pathway. But this is the time when you really make sense from those findings, and you begin to really choose a scenario for the future. What's important about this meeting and what comes out of this meeting is that you're going to have a strategic framework from which to work. Up until now, you've been collecting data. The actual planning process really hasn't started. This is the strategic point in the strategic planning process, because this is when you begin to write the plan, to really now take that data and say, okay, what is this going to mean in terms of goals we have? What type of strategies are we going to connect to these goals and objectives? What kind of resources are we going to need? So once you come out of this retreat or meeting, you're going to have to make sure that you have that strategic framework. And you're really going to have to make sure that there is one organizational vision. That at this point in time, there really has to be clarity about vision and mission. Regardless of the scope of the plan, your mission and vision really comprise your North Star by which the organization is going to navigate. There has to be clarity and alignment around these two elements, or the strategic plan won't work for the organization. So the last, well, the penultimate phase, we would say, phase 4, is really about paving the road to the future. This is when you flesh out the plan, and this takes the plan to the level that is just prior to implementation. So you flesh out the plan, and it has to be done by people who really have the knowledge and expertise to do so. Typically, we create small groups that are assigned sections of the plan. Their work is based on the strategic framework developed during the retreat. The number of groups is dependent on the scope of the plan. So again, if you're having a very focused discussion, a focused plan, you may have only a few work groups during this period of time. The groups develop recommendations for strategies to meet the goals of the plan, and the planning committee has the responsibility to make sure all the sections of the plan are aligned and that there's clarity around needed resources and timing of strategies. And finally, the board has to approve the plan to make sure that it is really part of what the organization is going to hold itself accountable for in the future. We occasionally hear that plans are another document on the shelf and that their relevance once completed is questionable. So you remember we started out this conversation with saying, are plans relevant in today's changing environment? And now we're coming back to that same question. You've done the plan. You've decided it is important, but how do you ensure that it's a living plan? We hope that during this presentation we have conveyed the importance of planning and the ongoing relevance. But as managers and leaders, it's your role to ensure a living plan. From the day the plan is finalized, it needs to become part of the organizational fabric. That means integrating it into work plans, making people accountable, and monitoring progress. You know, I've often said as we work with clients that if your staff can't see themselves and what they do in the strategic plan, it's really hard for them to own it. There really has to be elements that link back into the annual work plans. People really need to understand how the goals of their departments link to the strategic plan. Again, in a more focused plan, you may not have all of the elements of the entire organization in that plan, but if you think of your logic model or of that thing that we did during the diagnostic where we talked about what are our outcomes and what are the strategies we're using to get there, we really want the whole organization to be able to look at that and say, yeah, I understand that those are the outcomes that we're all working toward, and these are some of the strategies that we link into. And then the piece about accountability is really important. We all know how difficult it is to sort of add something to the mix of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And we all know that unless what is in the strategic plan really gets monitored, unless we hold ourselves accountable for it, it's really easy to let those things fall through the cracks. And so we stress this a lot, but once the plan is done, the only way to make it a living document is for you to really make that commitment to use it, review it, and monitor it. Now, one of the last pieces I want to talk about is really that the strategic plan isn't static. It never should be. A good strategic plan maybe over the years gets dog-eared. You end up erasing things, making marks on it. You really need to look at a strategic plan as a compass, not a blueprint. Once the plan is implemented, assess and evaluate how your strategies are doing in reaching the outcomes you set out for yourself. Challenge and change your assumptions as the evidence shows you. Use evaluation as a learning tool. Use data to refine your thinking and to build it into future planning processes. Nonprofits really have the opportunity to thrive not just survive by being more strategic, setting priorities, and building learning into all of their decision making. This last slide is really helping us conceptualize sort of how the strategic planning framework really is a leadership tool. In the new reality, we believe that organizations need a new way of thinking about the relevance of planning and the role of leadership in learning and energizing the process. A dynamic strategic framework is based on really looking at making meaning out of data so as to be able to prioritize and to adapt to the changing environment and make decisions that position your organization for sustainability and mission impact. If you look at this slide, what we see is really a circular almost pattern where we implement our strategies, we learn from what we're doing, we take that learning and we incorporate it into our management of strategies. Leadership takes that learning and makes meaning out of it and adapts decision making and leads right back into planning. So we really see that this type of framework gives nonprofits the opportunity to really become strategic and impactful. On behalf of Ann and myself and TCC, thank you for joining us today. We have a few more minutes, and if you'd like, we're going to take some of the questions that you've been sending us. And Ann and I will sort of go do this back and forth and try and answer some of these questions.
So I think the first one, Shelly, in addition to following the person who asked me to speak up, the first question is, how do you balance between current core work, the work that you're doing every day, and new work? And there's a couple of ways. New work might mean taking on a process like strategic planning, or new work might mean the goals and objectives, the new things that get added as a result of a strategic plan. And I'll suggest, and then throw it back to Shelly, that if we're talking about the latter, meaning the new things that come out of a strategic plan, there's no simple answer, except the place to start is really by understanding that the point of strategic planning is not to create more work by itself. It's about maybe you want to do things differently, maybe you want to expand, maybe you do want to add some new things. But it's also understanding if we're adding new things, what do we let go of? Or if we're adding new things, how do we increase capacity so we're just not piling things on to people? So it's either about making the pie larger, so to speak, by increasing organizational capacity, whether it's human resources or other types of capacity, or it's about trade-offs, meaning if we're going to do this, what aren't we going to do?
And if you remember when I talked about the sort of meeting where you look at findings and make decisions, one of the key elements is looking at the implications of your choices. And so as Ann said, you may make choices to do new work, but there are implications for those choices, and you have to build that into the planning process. So the next question that I saw is about why should we limit our area of focus by our internal weakness when that can be changed? I hope that we did not convey the idea that we should develop our plans based on our internal weaknesses. What we were trying to say is that during the diagnostic phase, what you really want to do is get a good understanding about weaknesses, strengths, opportunities out there, the changing environment, because unless you have a good grasp of where the organization sits, how it's doing around some of the core capacities such as leadership or ability to manage resources or adaptive capacity in terms of being a learning organization, or even looking at whether you have the right expertise to deliver the programs. This is not a limitation on your focus. These allow you to really understand what are some of the critical pieces that you may have to address in order to be more sustainable in the future. So, and there may be internal strengths that you want to maximize as well. Another type of assessment is an asset-based assessment, where you really look at what are sort of the strengths the organization brings to the table and look at how those can be maximized. So it is not about focusing on weaknesses. It's about incorporating those into your worldview and really understand how those impact your ability to deliver on your mission.
I'd just add real quick that I think it also can be a credibility question, and a lot of times working with clients, what I've seen is sometimes cynicism or suspicion on the part of staff in particular that we're really not going to get to the real conversation or talk about what's really going on here. And while I'm a firm believer in a strengths-based approach, I think for me this also goes back to we're certainly not going to build on weaknesses. We don't want to dwell there. But this goes back to the slide where I talked about having candid conversations, being willing to change, and it is about rigorous self-assessment. And the next question is, how do you assess organizational assessment? And this question came up before Shelly started her part of the presentation, where she was talking about different assessment tools, the SWOT analysis, online tools, etc. I guess if I'll say to the writer of the question, if your question wasn't answered in the latter half of the presentation, please feel free to email us following the presentation, and we'd be happy to try to address your question. The next writer asked just about access to the slides after the presentation, and the organizer wrote back and said that we're going to send the slides to everyone who participated by tomorrow morning. And Shelly, why don't you take the next question?
The next question is about, I sometimes find myself in the dilemma of working with a client who undertakes strategic planning as a requirement of potential funders. The strategic plan takes the form of the staff developing a plan internally and sending it to the board for approval. Staff assumptions may be well formed, but I struggle with even calling the strategic plan. How do you deal with this situation? Well, going back and talking about organizational readiness to plan, if there's really not buy-in to the process of planning from the top, meaning leadership not only is doing it because they feel that they have to do it, but they feel they're doing it because they want to do it and think it's the right thing to do, then I would question whether it's a strategic plan as well. An organization really has to make a commitment to a plan. It is not an external document, although of course you might share it externally. A real strategic plan is an internal tool. It's a leadership tool, it's a learning tool, and it gives you the ability to make better decisions. Now, if you're only doing it for someone else's purpose, and you're not spending the time really looking at what questions are that you need to answer, what are the things that you feel are critical for your organization, then it may provide some basic direction. It may be useful in helping staff think out some issues that they've been dealing with. But I'd agree with you. It's not strategic planning, and therefore I think that's one of the questions that you really have to deal with right up front. Is
Yeah,
there organizational buy-in?
Yeah, I would say it's a readiness question, really.
Exactly.
And that is consultants. I assume it was a consultant who wrote that question. That's something I know that Shelly and I deal with all the time, is how do we assess readiness to, and this could be true even of the nonprofit that says, I really want to do this. It goes back to ability to change, capacity to change, capacity to engage in difficult conversations, willingness to make tough decisions, etc. I'm mindful of the time. I know we have like one more minute, so we'll do a couple other questions, Shelly.
Why don't you do the next one?
Okay, well, we talked about competition and offered some ideas for how to define competition. The next one is, how long might a process like this take? How much time of the leader coordinating this type of process? And I know that we gave the sort of flip answer that you can't do this in a weekend or over a board retreat. And I guess the short answer is it depends. The longer answer is I don't think I've done, in my experience, a strategic plan that, from beginning to end that took less than 4 or 5 months. I've had some go over a year. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Usually it's because of extenuating circumstances. But I'd say it's somewhere between 6 and maybe 8, 9 months is average for the way we do at least the comprehensive strategic planning process. I think a more narrowed, focused process could certainly be shorter. And how much time is the leader coordinating this type of process? Again, it really depends. I don't know that there's a specific number of hours per week. A lot of times leaders who have an administrative support person will also tell them to allocate a certain amount of time to help with logistics. I will say that it takes more time typically for the ED at the end than it does at the beginning, because at the beginning is when all the data collection is going on and really the consultant plays the primary role. Toward the end, the consultant takes on more of a facilitator role, and while that's still important, we ask leaders and various stakeholders to get more engaged in things like planning meetings and actually helping to draft the plan.
So that's all the time we have today, and I hope we've given you a little food for thought in thinking about the new options that you might have for strategic plan and how to make it a more dynamic process for your organization. Please feel free to visit our website, www.tccgroup.com, and contact us if you have any additional questions. Thank you.